It's Wednesday, June 29th, 2022, and this is KBIA's Views of the News. Our weekly roundtable on media behaviors comes to you from the studio at the Reynolds Journalism Institute. I'm Amy Simons, and here with me are my colleagues, Kiely and Earnest Perry. On our program this week, we're going to spend a good chunk of the next half hour talking about the Supreme Court's decision handed down Friday overturning Roe v. Wade from a number of different angles. We're also going to talk about something from yesterday afternoon, that surprise hearing from the Senate Select Committee, where a lot of things came out there. And we're going to talk about an initiative to give credit where credit is due. We're going to talk about going beyond the traditional byline to acknowledge everyone's effort to bring you the news. There's a lot more that hopefully we'll get to before our time is up, but let's start with that decision Friday morning. 6-3, the decision in the Dobbs versus Jackson case, overturning the 50-year-old precedent established in Roe versus Wade. Now, this wasn't much of a surprise. Back on May 2nd, Politico published a leaked opinion written by Justice Samuel Alito striking down the constitutional protection for abortion. And Friday, that leak became law. So let's start by talking about the coverage in general, because even though we knew this was very likely to happen and exactly the way that it did, it was still a bit of a gut punch when it came down in that moment.
Well, you saw the big, this is war kind of headlines, really big font, and it was treated wall-to-wall coverage. NPR went live for several hours with talking about the decision and the implications. And I think that is because, even though, as you said, Amy, it was signaled certainly by the leaked Alito report, and the opinion was very similar to the one that was leaked, it was real now. I mean, we had the court deciding, and this is an enormous sea change for the country and is going to have a big impact on a lot of people's lives. So that's why you saw the kind of coverage you did.
Yeah, I think one of the things that really struck me was, the fact that I think the most news organizations were prepared for it. They knew it was coming, and they prepared. They had their teams in place. They knew who they wanted to cover it. They knew what angles they wanted to take. I think the surprise for many of them was not what Alito said, but what Thomas said, and his concurring opinion, which basically said we need to look at all of these landmark decisions that are related to the Equal Protection Clause under the 14th Amendment, and so now they're sort of the news media is sort of going like, whoa, wait a minute, where is this going after this? So the next day's story, or 2 days story after the initial Friday.
So that your Sunday story.
It's like the
Sunday
aftershock.
story. Yeah. So those stories were, where do we go now? And so, whereas they probably were thinking, where do we go now in terms of how this is going to play out, is what's going to happen in the states. Yes, that is a story. They were covering it. Now they're also looking at the court to go, where's the court going to go now? Are they going to go back and relitigate all of those cases? We're talking about marriage equality. We're talking about contraceptive protection. All of those cases are gonna are they gonna all come back up again? People are worried.
One of the things that was also interesting to me, and Kathy, you brought this up yesterday even, was what we hadn't really. Well, maybe you and I hadn't expected to see as many stories as we were, especially here in Missouri, about where and how to still access abortion care. That as those trigger laws went into effect here I think, Ernest, I was talking to somebody in your office at like 9:30, 9:45 in the morning. And by that time, it was already illegal here because of the way that the trigger laws worked here in Missouri. But so many of the news organizations providing people with the information about where and how do you go to still access this?
Kind of the news you can use.
Yeah.
I mean, we saw both the Columbia Missourian, I think, right after the leak, and then the Columbia Tribune right after the actual decision, running stories that were very almost a user's guide, practical advice on here's the clinics, here's how far it is from Columbia, here's the website, that kind of thing. And given the controversial nature of the topic, just that kind of a flat story is almost a statement, but I think it also indicates that this is a topic. It indicates, I think, the disconnect between the majority opinion in the country, if the polls are to be believed, and I think they are, that most Americans, certainly my anecdotal experience from reporting out stories like this is, most Americans want to preserve some right to an abortion. And the court and the state legislatures in many states are nullifying that completely. So when you have that kind of a disconnect, I think what you see are the news editors who are also sensitive to their public saying, this is a story our readers need and our readers want. And I think it's just another striking sign of how long this controversy is going to last and continue to play out.
No, I would agree with that. I mean, the other thing, too, is that you also see that many news organizations have sort of come to the consensus that the Supreme Court is now a part of the political process. For the longest time, the news media has looked at the judicial branch or judicial side of our governmental structure as sort of neutral. Mm-hmm. They're there to arbitrate what happens between the executive and the legislative. That all bets are off on that now. I mean, they are starting to cover the Supreme Court as a political entity. And you saw some of that if you go back to the Kavanaugh hearings and that sort of thing. But when we went into the 2020 election and the possibility that Donald Trump was going to legally be able to have some sort of impact on how that was going to play out and whether or not Kavanaugh or Amy Coney Barrett or Clarence Thomas would factor into that, you started seeing the news media move into this political realm. But now with this, they are fully in on the fact that the Supreme Court is now a political entity and will be covered as such.
Well, and this was going to be the last topic that we talked about in this whole string of angles I wanted to get to, but now is as good as a time to talk about it as any, because as you bring that up, there's a piece on our Links blog as well from Nina Totenberg about, given her decades of work covering the court, that any precedent, it's ready to be we can't sit on precedent anymore, and that the court does need to be covered in a whole new way. What kind of questions might there be in going back to what was said in confirmation hearings and how the justices really turned 180s in a lot of, I think about Amy Coney Barrett, who said what she said, or
well, there have been stories about Susan Collins
saying she was flat out lied
she felt
to.
She was that she was played.
But then you also have the vice president, who at the time was on the Senate Judiciary Committee, basically saying, I didn't believe them when they said it. So that now that plays that whole dynamic of politics that we talk about, which is you're going to have senators who are going to openly challenge future nominees in the way that you're seeing what's happening with the January 6th.
And I think
but that's
I
not
think
a
what
bad
you're
thing,
saying
is it?
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know.
Well, I think there's always been, and I think Earnest is right, there's always been a different attitude about the court. And, the justices have gotten kind of this pass. Okay, we understand you can't say anything about a case that might come before you. I think the members of the Senate have given them that pass. I don't think that's necessarily going to exist anymore. I also think there's going to be an effort to get more leaks.
Yes.
And that never was the case at the court. But a leak is a political move.
Exactly. I was going to say, I was having a conversation with somebody about this yesterday who indicated to me that leak, maybe it wasn't a leak. Maybe it was intentional so that the public, yes, there were protests, yes, there were marches Friday, Saturday into the weekend, but so much of that had already happened in early May that there was this idea that, things didn't...
Oh, you think it was a preemptive leak?
It was a preemptive... Okay. That there was a theory out there that it was a preemptive leak so that people who were going to have very strong feelings about this had an opportunity to work through them before there was an opportunity for this to
which
for this not to just become that like drop and like, wait, what just happened
But that
here?
underlines the point. No matter who makes the leak, it's always for a political reason. And the fact that a leak came from the court says to you that the court is seeing itself as a political institution. And they are playing like politicians, not like judges.
And the other interesting thing that I saw in the coverage, especially the next day's coverage, was Justice Roberts. And he's the Chief Justice. And he has always been concerned about what is the legacy of the court going to be. I think he is really concerned about that right now, because do you want to be on the side of Plessy versus Ferguson, or do you want to be on the side of Brown versus Board of Education? And this is one of those decisions that could put you on
the wrong side of
history. And he is really concerned about that, because he is literally, in those who've covered the courts for a long time, Nina Totenberg and others, and constitutional and legal scholars are saying this, is that he has lost, as a Chief Justice, he has lost control of the middle, because there is no middle.
Well, and this is exactly the opposite of what he said during his confirmation hearings, which I covered, that he wanted, which is he wants to find a middle ground. He wants to build consensus on the court. And I just don't see that happening for a long, long time. The happiest person in Washington right now is probably Justice Breyer, who, as of tomorrow, is retired.
I was going to say he's out of here, right?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. No,
see you later. I'll be on the beach with an umbrella drink.
No, absolutely. But I mean, the other part to this too is that the news media, I think, has done an effective job of really what are going to be the effects of this? Really covering what are going to be the effects of this. First, how people are feeling about it. And showing the divisiveness, but also showing how it's galvanized certain generation of women and those who support them.
And in fact, a couple of really good examples of this. The Washington Post piece that is on our links blog, the Washington Post just kind of putting out their question of what are you thinking, how are you feeling today? Hearing back from 23,000 readers. Now,
that's amazing.
That is a huge, okay, so it may not sound like a huge number, but we've always been told that when you get that phone call in the newsroom from the angry viewer or from the really happy viewer, there are however many others at home that have that same sentiment. So there's that multiplier that's going on there. Also, another piece that's really interesting when you talk about the generational shifts, how the Gen X, not so much Gen X, the Gen Y and the Gen Z generations, younger people, how TikTok and short videos on TikTok have really been galvanizing the generation. And in a space where a lot of older folks like us aren't there to have part of that, to take the wind out of their sails.
But will they vote?
Right.
That is what's really going to be an interesting question, because the midterm elections are coming up. And I know that there are a lot of people in the Democratic Party who want the president to do something. I thought his response was really interesting, which is, it's in your hands. It's on the ballot.
Yeah. I think the other interesting part, too, is that you have many who are the real true activists. It's interesting to look at this. The activists who are aghast at what the decision that came down are really vocal, and they're out there and they're actually strategizing and they're planning and they're doing these things. Those who, after 50 years of fighting, who have now gotten what they wanted, are eerily quiet right now. And it's sort of interesting to sort of watch that dynamic and how the media is trying to, we want to get all the views here, but you have this one particular group who have been vehemently and very vocal for the last 50 years, who have now all of a sudden
Well, this
don't
is going to
wanna-
be, as a political reporter, I think it's going to be interesting to watch. You did hear some things. The Washington Post had a really good story. I think it was in Sunday's paper, and I think they were the only ones there in Branson, Missouri, where there was a meeting of Christian legislators, the National Christian, I may have the National Christian State Legislators, I may have the name a little bit off, but there were a number of people at that meeting who said, okay, now we've got to go for a national ban. Now we've got to start prosecuting women who go across state lines. We've got to prohibit the mail-in
the prescription
day after bill or day after pill. And so I think those are the kinds of things. The reason for the quiescence you're talking about is probably there are a lot of people who want to win elections in the fall who don't want to talk about that.
Right.
And so the question is which side, which constituency or which group is going to win? The people who want to kind of keep a lid on things and let's not upset people. Because I think, as I said before, this is a decision that really goes against what the polls tell us the majority of American people want. And how is that going to play out politically? And I think that's the calculus that a lot of these people are trying to work with. What I'm not hearing, although I will say Marjorie Daniheiser, I think the head of the, who was very active in trying to get this the abortion ban enacted, she said, now we have to support mothers and children. I'm not hearing a lot of that.
No, I'm not hearing a lot of that. I heard that.
Because
and
that costs money.
Yeah.
That costs a lot of money.
And
so we'll see.
and time.
The politics of this are going to be fascinating.
What about some other voices that maybe we're not hearing about? One of the things that I was reading a lot about on journalisms, on Richard Prince's site, was that we weren't hearing as much from the anti-abortion communities of color.
Right.
That there has been a long tradition in communities of color, in part because of religious beliefs, for other reasons as well. We're not hearing from those voices in the coverage in the same way.
Well, I mean, I think part of the reason is because there's this sort of within communities of color, you're right about the strong religious influence there in terms of which direction you're going to go, and which makes it difficult but they also understand that all of the other things that are connected to this in terms of contraceptive rights and access to health care and those things, all of that's intermingled. And in those instances, in many of those instances, they have the support's not there. They've always been on the bottom end of that. And so their concern is that by the court's decision, this has a possibility of making it even more difficult for communities of color to get the health care that they need and to get the support that they need. And when women in those situations find themselves having to make those decisions, and then all of a sudden they have to carry the baby to term and they have to take care. Is the state going to be there to help? Is there going to be any kind of
safety net?
Any kind of safety net? And there
net.
hasn't been, and there's been an erosion of it. So now we're going to be even deeper in these very harsh situations.
Okay, so just as in the case after the election of Donald Trump, after the death of George Floyd, and so many other painful points in our recent history, journalists have found themselves feeling the feelings just like everyone else. We are human beings, just as people who aren't working in our profession. And again, we find ourselves coming back to that question of objectivity. How do we process those feelings, and where and how do we share them? There were several legacy organizations that sent out memos first thing Friday morning reminding their staffs social media isn't that place. You only go to a march if you're covering that march. And there are a lot of people who are still very much upset about that.
Well, I mean, they're pushing back, and I think a lot of it is that, you have the old guard, which is saying we need to be objective and objectivity, and you have some of the younger journalists who are basically saying, but there needs to be some sort of moral equivalency, as Wesley Lowery would put it. So now you've got this continuing tug of war going on, this existential crisis within journalism as to, wait a minute, we are people too, and we have informed opinions, and those informed opinions should be in our journalism so that we can combat some of this sort of belief that we are either part of this side of the story or part of that side of the story.
So,
yeah, but I'm going to make myself unpopular with my students, but those informed opinions belong in your news columns, not in you, and they need to be backed up with data and reporting. Popping off on Twitter, I just don't see the point. I think that if you have a platform like Views of the News or KBIA or the Columbia Missourian, why do you need anything else? And if what you say, it might be emotionally satisfying for 10 seconds, but it means that that person whom you'd like to interview has a reason to say no to you. And I've had students say to me, I don't want to talk to that person whose points are against mine. And I always say, well, first of all, you might learn something from talking to that person, and that person might learn something from talking to you. So I think what we need now is to build bridges, not to burn them down. And I worry that just that instant gratification of getting my bumper sticker out there on the internet is going to foreclose that possibility.
You're absolutely right. I mean, I do think that all of this brand building, which is a lot of that, does make it difficult for you to, as a journalist, to be able to say, but I am also trying to provide news and information to the public. When you can't say it's about me on social media, but then turn around and say it's not about me in my journalism. And that becomes a problem.
Yeah, I mean, secret news, folks, we all have opinions and feelings. Yeah. But if you're a journalist, you work really, really hard, just like an athlete works really, really hard to train for that game. You work really, really hard to put them aside so that you can hear, and I mean really hear, somebody who has a different point of view. Yeah. And I think to the extent that we get out of training, we make it a lot harder on ourselves to do that.
Okay. All of this is happening on the backdrop of the January 6th hearings, which we had thought were in recess until July.
Surprise.
Surprise, quite literally. They called a surprise hearing yesterday. Cassidy Hutchinson's testimony was stunning, to me at least. Hearing how our former president urged security measures be dropped at the rally, that they stopped using magnetometers when it was known that there were people who were armed because they weren't coming after him, or that when he found out he wasn't going to be allowed to go to the Capitol, that he tried to make a reach for the steering wheel of his they call it the beast in his motorcade. There was a lot there yesterday.
There was a lot there yesterday, and it's interesting because when you read this, you kind of go like, okay, a little unhinged there. You know, if what was said.
Remember when he called Omarosa unhinged?
Yeah. I mean, if all of this is true, that's as they're saying, some of this is borderline conspiracy, borderline inciting a riot. Wanting to participate in said riot. So it was amazing. However, you also have some that says, wait a minute, does this rise to the level of something he could be a crime he could be charged with?
I asked somebody if it's assault. If he's reaching for the neck of his security detail and trying to grab a steering wheel of a car someone else's.
Well, I don't know.
But I'm not a legal expert, and I'm not going to throw that out there.
We could definitely get him with vandalism for damaging federal property for throwing his lunch. Yeah, the ketchup at the White House. But no, I mean, all of that it was a sort of a titillating insight into I think things we've known about Donald Trump's character, which is that he's impulsive, he throws tantrums, etc. What I took away from that, and what really I found shocking to the core, was how many other people in the White House were willing to enable and condone that behavior. And I thought the most damaging part of that testimony was the part that was leveled at Mark Meadows, who is a former member of Congress who seemed to be twiddling his thumbs as Rome burned and as his own former colleagues were under attack. I mean, the significance of saying, take the mags away is, people are heavily armed. That was attested to yesterday,
Right.
that it was well known within the inner circle of the White House that you had people with dangerous armaments going up to the Capitol, where there were members of Congress, the vice president, who were targeted. And knowing that and allowing it to happen and standing by and doing nothing, I thought, is this 1930s? Is this Germany in the 1930s? I mean, this is shocking. It was like this mass psychosis going on inside the White House. Now, not everybody fell victim. I mean, clearly, Cassidy Hutchinson didn't, and some of the other people who were in what they're calling Team Normal. But this was shocking to see this kind of behavior really putting people in danger and just saying, oh, well, that's the way it is.
The interesting part to all this is the viewership. I think from a news media standpoint, is the viewership for these hearings. And in particular, the one that happened yesterday. I mean, people are really paying attention to this. The question becomes, what kind of impact and influence will that have at the next election? How's that going to play out in terms of which Republican Party are we talking about? Are we talking about Trump's Republican Party? Or are we talking about
Liz
Cheney's Republican Party? Now, it's interesting if you go and you look at the elections that were held yesterday in Illinois, the Trump side of the Republican Party won in that senatorial primary.
And the gubernatorial one
as well. In Colorado, it was the Liz Cheney side that won. So it's going to be real interesting to see how that plays out and what happens after these hearings are over. The report comes out. What does the Justice Department do?
Right, and I think the other story we talked about plays into this. If you have people, extreme views taking the lead, what is that going to do in November?
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Before we go, I want to talk about giving credit where credit is due, going beyond the traditional byline and acknowledging the team of people who it takes to put out news and information and to get that in front of you. And our colleague Michaela Rodenbaugh wrote a piece that was edited by Kat Duncan and Randy Picht for RJI's website, introducing an effort at Vox magazine called the Expanding Credit Project. How's that going to work?
Oh, I think it's a great idea. I mean, I think one of the things we tell students now is journalism is a participatory sport and you are going to work on a team. And particularly in a multimedia world, any project you do that's worth anything is going to take a team. And so giving credit where credit is due.
And so
Awesome.
Instead of just the writer, which traditionally has been how bylines have worked, each person in that publication process would also receive credit. It would be a shared byline or a box within
More like
the
movie
story
credits.
itself. Exactly.
Credit roll.
Who reported and wrote the story? Who edited the story? Who was the digital producer? Who was the person who got that online? Or who was the page designer where you saw it there? So it's an opportunity to involve everybody who has a hand in that work, and not just the people who are front and center, the ones who are in front of the cameras, giving everybody that credit.
Yeah, some of the most unsung heroes in newspapers are headline writers.
That's right.
Well, not just them. As we are out of time for this week, we're going to thank you for spending the last half hour with us. You can read more about each of the topics we talked about today on our links blog under the programs and podcast tabs at kbia.org. We're also available wherever you get your podcast downloads, including iTunes, Spotify, and Stitcher. Like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter. I want to make sure that we leave plenty of time today to thank RJI's Travis McMillan for directing today's show, and to Takia Thomas, who's handling our audio. Tim Pilcher composed our original theme music, and Nate Brown is our social media producer. See what I did there? We'll be back with you in 2 weeks.